Thank you all for coming to the Scholars Program and for staying to the end of the day. I, for one, have been very inspired to hear all of these excellent clinicians and researchers and see the very vibrant status of our field. So I'm also very glad to be able to conclude the program with some talks from two tremendously accomplished researchers in our field who have a perspective on where we should go from here. So those clinicians are George Mashour from the University of Michigan and Beverley Orser from the University of Toronto. And we'll start with Dr. Mashour. He is the Associate Dean for Clinical and Translational Research at the University of Michigan Medical School. He also serves as the Executive Director of the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, a translational science institute funded through the NIH CTSA program. Dr. Mashour also serves as the Executive Director of Translational Research in the Central Office of Research, overseeing translational activities across all colleges and campuses of the University of Michigan. In this capacity, he leads the university's Translational Research Council and also developed a Center for Drug Repurposing, which will be officially launched later in 2019. On the national level, Dr. Mashour is a member of the NIH CTSA Program Steering Committee. He's co-chair of the Translational Methods and Processing Domain Task Force of the CTSA program. And he is also on the board of directors of the Association for Clinical and Translational Science and serves as editor-in-chief of their official journal. In 2017, Dr. Mashour was the PI of a $58 million NIH U54 grant that supports the University of Michigan CTSA Institute. And in 2018, he was the PI of a $5 million grant from the CTSA program to lead a national consortium that improves patient access to experimental therapeutics. So, Dr. Mashour.
So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. I want to thank Kate for that generous introduction. It's extremely flattering, probably because I wrote it. But I wrote it with a specific intention in mind, okay? I would hope that most of you who know me would think of me as an anesthesiologist, as a neuroscientist who studies consciousness. I talked about it earlier today, but I wanted you to hear about a fairly robust set of career activities that doesn't have anything to do with anesthesiology. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I do in that capacity, and then reflect on the opportunity cost and think about the future of anesthesiology through the prism of activities that transcend the traditional confines and boundaries of our field. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the CTSA Institute that I direct, some of the activities, and I'm going to do so for three reasons. I'm not here to talk about me per se, but I want to make sure you're up to speed on just basic translational science concepts. The CTSA institutes that you might have at your institution are very relevant to your career development because we're focused on individuals like you and from all disciplines. And then three, again, we can talk a little bit about what those activities have cost and what they have done for me, my department, and the field of anesthesiology. So translational research is a confusing term. Dr. Chris Austin, who's the director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, published an article in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery last year called Translating Translation. And so I just wanted to let you in on this so you have that basic conception. Translation is the process of turning observations in the lab, clinic, and community into interventions that improve the health of individuals and the public. Translational research is the activity that tries to get one from a certain phase of translation to another. For example, the classic bench to bedside. And translational science is the systematic investigation of this process in the hopes of making it more efficient and accelerating translation. So what we do at CTSA Institutes is focused on translational science so we can help people do more efficient translational research so that our institutions and communities can accomplish translation. And the translational cycle has been described in a variety of different ways, but starting with the T0 phase, basic and preclinical research. I like to think of this as the text to be translated. Just like if you have a great novel, it's going to be translated into many languages. If you have a poor novel, it probably isn't going to be. So the key to a great translational ecosystem is great basic science. Then moving to T1, translation to patients, you could think about a drug discovery process, for example. You start in the lab, you do preclinical safety testing, then you get it into healthy volunteers, for example, for a toxicity study. Move to T2, that's translating it to patients. That might be the clinical trial space, T1 also, but that's not enough. You need to think about implementation if you want to make an impact. And that is the T3 space of clinical implementation. And then finally, T4, healthcare delivery and policy. To simplify it, T1's going to people, T2 to patients, T3 to practice, and T4 to population health and policy, all the while thinking about healthcare improvements and community involvement. So we direct an institute. I direct it. We have about 90 to 100 full-time staff members, many of whom have PhDs. There are about 30 to 50 faculty members. We try to enhance this translational process through education, funding, connecting individuals, and supporting researchers. So our institute was founded in 2006. We got the first CTSA award in 2007, renewal in 2012, and then the 2017 grant that I got. And importantly, we're part of a consortium of more than 50 institutions, and I'm sure many of the individuals here in the US have CTSA institutes at their institutions that are working together to accelerate discoveries toward better health and really enhancing career development. So these are the various sites. And I'm just going to run quickly through the services because for those of you who are exposed to CTSA institutes, you can think about how this can help your career. We have education and training programs such as master's degrees in clinical research, career development mentoring such as the KL2 program, and I know at least one ESAS member has recently gotten a KL2, different recurring events, grant writing support, pilot grant funding, community engagement, participant recruitment, and then a number of support services that are critical for the research process. And finally, regulatory support. And I just wanted to touch base, or touch upon rather, a recent grant that we got to enhance access to experimental therapeutics. And that's through the FDA Expanded Access Program. So what is expanded access? Sometimes referred to as compassionate use, and it's really the attempt to get an experimental therapeutic that is not FDA approved to a patient who is in need in a life-threatening or serious health condition who's not eligible for a clinical trial. So the patient has to have a serious disease or condition, there's no comparable therapy, they can't enroll in a clinical trial, there's a risk-benefit assessment, and then the expanded access use cannot interfere with an ongoing clinical trial. These patients are usually very sick, and the classic areas of expanded access would be like infectious disease, an experimental antibiotic, or oncology is another area, and also medical devices. So there are many stakeholders in this expanded access process. You have to engage physicians, patients, industry who provide the drugs. And we support this for our institution, and this is something I made a priority around 2016, and we've now had an increasing number of expanded access requests. And in this year, we helped 590 patients get treated who had very, very serious illness. And this has been exciting for me as an anesthesiologist to touch on clinical care in areas that I normally would never be involved in. I'm going to give you an example of a successful story with expanded access in which the CTSA Institute partnered with biomedical engineers and surgeons to treat an otherwise lethal condition known as tracheobronchomalacia. So it's a weakening of the trachea. It leads to collapse. And these children typically end up dying. They're intubated, but there was really no therapy for these very vulnerable patients. And so what colleagues at the University of Michigan did is they developed customized 3D printed bioresorbable splints that could be surgically implanted. And this was kind of a first-in-class use. There had never been a 3D printed device that was implanted in humans. There are a lot of regulatory issues around this. There are ethical issues. And basically what we did at our institute is to help them through this process, help them leverage the expanded access process. And there has now been a case series, and there's an article published in Science Translational Medicine, where these individuals could get out of the ICU. Literally, they would have otherwise been dead. And so that has been really an inspiring set of research activities and regulatory activities for me as an anesthesiologist. So we wanted to take some of our local success and think about how we can develop a more coherent network focused on expanded access. Because the problem is you have a lot of these experimental therapeutics that are given to individual patients, but it's just kind of one-off treatment. There's really no coherent data collection, or standardized data collection. And it's also a very tricky space from the regulatory perspective because it's not really research. I mean, it's clinical care, but it's right at that border of experimental therapy and clinical care. So we applied for this grant and engaged 3 other CTSA institutes, University of Rochester, Duke, UT Southwestern Medical Center. And we have also now engaged other CTSA institutes. We've engaged major pharmaceutical companies who are now interested in this. Janssen Pharmaceuticals of Johnson & Johnson, Takeda, Novartis, because they're interested in how a more coherent data collection system could help them better understand these drugs. We're also working with the National Organization for Rare Disorders. These individuals might not be able to have a clinical trial, and they're going to depend on this expanded access process and hopefully data derived from it in order to have a therapy that gets approved by the FDA. And this is just a picture of our group recently. And our logic model, we're following this mantra of the CTSA program at NIH, which is to develop, demonstrate, and disseminate. So in the developmental phase, we're establishing best practices across institutions for expanded access. We're establishing data collection processes so we can perhaps make some inferences, at least about safety, perhaps efficacy. We're then going to move into a demonstration with cohort-based expanded access protocols. We're working on one now with Hemopure, which is an artificial oxygen carrier. Real-world data collection, which is of paramount importance to the FDA these days. And then finally, we're going to try to disseminate these processes across the CTSA network. So again, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of some of the things that I do in this role. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunity cost. I spend the majority of my time working in this translational science space. It has reduced the amount of time that I could be doing things that I really love, like the neurobiology of consciousness or neuroanesthesiology. So why am I doing it? And how is this relevant to your future and the future of our field? So is this opportunity cost worth it for me? Is it worth it for my department? And is it worth it for the field of anesthesiology? So it has definitely been worth it for me. I have learned so much about so many different fields, and another way of viewing research through this translational science prism that I just never would have encountered had I stayed focused in my clinical and my scientific specialty. I've also gotten to have and develop really robust collaborations and connections with all of the chairs in the medical school, all of the deans in the medical school, many of the deans in the health sciences, and vice presidents in various roles at the University of Michigan. That's good for me. It's also good for my department because we are in a very good position to be influential in terms of the research landscape. At the University of Michigan, there's a chief scientific officer, and there are 2 associate deans for research, me and Sachin Kedarpal. So 2 anesthesiologists are in influential roles in overseeing different aspects of the research enterprise. So that's wonderful for our department, because what I would like to convey to the dean, and I think what's important ultimately for all of us to do, is that having a vibrant academic anesthesiology department is not just good for the department, it's good for the enterprise. It's good for the medical school. It's good for the health system. And similarly, in terms of the field of anesthesiology, I think it's really important for us to, even if we love what we do and we love our scientific interest, to really transcend some of those boundaries. I think I'm as far as I know, the first anesthesiologist to lead a CTSA institute. I had to go head-to-head with people in internal medicine who are usually chosen for these positions. It's great for our field, for people at the institution and nationally to see anesthesiologists in this different role. So how does this apply to you, especially in the early phases? I'm not saying that when you're on a K, you should start thinking about all these different activities. I think you need to focus, you need to get to a level of independence. But keep an open mind. I would have never imagined that I would end up in this role, but I sort of had an initial opportunity, I took it, and then it blossomed. And that could happen to you, and it could be amazing for your career and great for your department. One of the things that you can start thinking about now, so that all the things that you love won't just start fading away once you take on new roles, is to develop a team. And that is something that I think is underemphasized for junior faculty, because you're usually thinking about you and the work that you need to do, and you think you're going to have the big research team later. Whatever that means to you, start developing your team. Because I have been able to move to different administrative roles and still maintain a very active research portfolio because I have mentored many people and brought them up through the ranks so they can now run a lot of the day-to-day operations and I can engage more on an intellectual level. So one thing you can start to do to prepare for this kind of future that might involve something different is to really start building your team now. So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to having more of a discussion after Dr. Orser speaks. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Mashour. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Beverley Orser. She is the professor and chair of the Department of Anesthesia at the University of Toronto. She's a staff anesthesiologist and co-director of research in the Department of Anesthesia at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center. She received her medical doctorate from Queen's University and a PhD in medical science from the University of Toronto, and then completed postgraduate training at the Royal Columbian Hospital in British Columbia, McMaster University in Hamilton, Oxford University, and the University of Toronto. Her illustrious research career is focused on GABA A receptors and mechanisms of general anesthetics. She's published over 150 peer-reviewed articles, and her studies of extrasynaptic GABA A receptors have led to patented new treatments. In addition to her basic science research, she is an excellent advocate for patient safety and has founded or co-founded patient care organizations, including the Perioperative Brain Health Center and the Institute for Safe Medication Practices Canada. She's also on the steering committee for Smart Tots, and of course has received countless awards, including she was the first recipient of the Frontiers in Anesthesia Research Award from IARS, and the first anesthesiologist selected as Canada Research Chair. And recently, she received the gold medal from the Canadian Anesthesiologists Society and the award for excellence in research from the American Society of Anesthesiologists. So, Dr. Orser?
Right, so thank you, Kate, for being such a wonderful host, and to all of you for attending the session. So, preparing for the future of anesthesiology now. I took a very different approach to this because I think the future of anesthesiology are the people sitting in this room and others like you. You are our future, and I have to commend George Mashour and Michael Avedon for really embracing ESAS and ensuring that it was part of the IARS family, and for making a home so that there's an international home for scholars, and so that you can learn from each other and set up your networks now and early. Just like George was saying, it's very important that you look at your networks and teams early in your career. So I thought what I would do is maybe take a bit of a personal journey. How did I get where I am? I figure this is the family dinner and grandma's, waxing philosophical. But I just want to put out how I got to where I am. And then I think the most important part of the session will be opening it up for questions. And all questions are fair game. So I'm going to just start by, I suppose it's the green button, you heard my profile. I'm going to add one more important piece, and that's I'm also a mother. Because many of you are family people as well, and that's a very important part of my life. I often get asked about this as a woman in the profession, so I just want to mention this. I have 3 children that are very important to me, and my family life's important. This picture is from a canoe trip. I had a significant birthday, and the kids said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "A canoe trip." And so we're at the put-in up on the French River, but I noticed this sign you see here, "Danger, high-speed train." Does anyone notice something about this sign? Right, it's like high-speed train, rather than high-speed train. And so I put this up just to say the intention is good, but my message may be off a bit. So it's up to you to take what you want from this. It's really just to share my journey and help you on yours. Okay, so why am I an anesthesiologist? I didn't know what I was going to do. I did 2 years of medical school and then 2 years undergrad straight into medical school. And I didn't know what I was going to do. In the last year of medical school, I went down and volunteered in St. Lucia. They had a Giardia program run by the Rockefeller that I was interested in, and there was a hospital in an underserviced area that I wanted to work in. And I thought, this will be a great elective. They've got great beaches. But the problem was, a few days before I took off and flew to the island, there was a hurricane, Class 5, Hurricane Allen. It killed a number of people. It delayed me getting down to St. Lucia, but when I got there, it was a mess. The main physician was a Canadian, an anesthesiologist, and I watched how he worked. And Vince Hughes, he was a remarkable physician, and he took charge when that crisis happened. I watched him manage the ORs, take care of the sickest patients. He was a generalist as well as an anesthesiologist, and I thought, wow, I want to do that. So I went back to the university and I trained as a family doctor anesthetist, what we call FPAs in Canada. 6 months of training and I was out on the hustings. You can imagine, I was constantly nervous and was stationed up in northern Newfoundland, about the 49th parallel, up around something like Churchill, Manitoba, where the polar bears live, community 1300. But we served the fishing villages that dotted the Atlantic coast. And so there was a small hospital that served the cottage industry and the fishing industry, and I was the only anesthetist at times in that area. I loved the work, but it was challenging, to say the least. And eventually I decided I was going to come back to the big mothership and finish my residency training, which I did. It wasn't until I got into late residency that I got interested in biomedical research, because quite frankly, I didn't even know it was a career. But I saw people around me that were interested in asking very important questions using the best of science, and I thought, oh, that's really exciting. So I did my PhD after I finished residency. So why research? Simply because it was so exciting to me. I looked around and I saw people doing a variety of things, teaching, administration, but research drew me in. And so after completing the PhD, I set up a lab, and we asked some really simple questions. How do anesthetics work? What are their side effects? How can they be mitigated? And focused on the GABA receptor, which was known to be an important target, but there was a lot of lessons to be learned. And I'm not going to go into the science because it's not the purpose of this talk, but just to say, I think one of our most interesting observations happened 20 years into our science, and that we've learned that the drugs don't only cause the allosteric actions, that cause the inhibition, but once the drugs are, the brain is exposed and eliminated, we've learned that after that profound neurodepressive effect, there's a triggering of an overexpression of these receptors, and it can cause subtle deficits that are possibly contributing to the type of problems we see in the post-op period. And so we've been chasing that notion of this non-allosteric action now, this overexpression, and looking for ways to mitigate that through a variety of pharmacological approaches. And identified a number of drugs which selectively inhibit those receptors that are overexpressed. And for that work, we received a patent in the US and a patent in Canada, and we've tried to work with the pharmaceutical companies that make these molecules, both Roche and Cardiff University and a number of other ones, to try and do the translational work that George is talking about. And so we received the first patent for a drug treatment for post-op cognitive deficits that targets alpha-5 GABA receptors. And we received this because it's a useful discovery, it's novel, But it was unexpected because we did not expect the drugs to cause an upregulation of these memory blocking, what we call stupid receptors, because the animals are kind of stupid after the anesthetic for up to a week. And then we've been doing more work, working with our colleagues to develop new molecules. Ask the question, well, why are there so many receptors? And we've learned that the particular ones that are overexpressed have a trafficking mechanism, a unique machinery that gets them up to the surface. So we've developed a peptide that gets in there to disrupt that trafficking, conjugated it to the TAP molecule, which is the HIV really infective molecule. It gets into this cell, and at least in animal models, we can prevent the injury and trying to move this discovery along. This is in very early phase. And so there's a patent pending on that discovery. And this is just to remind me to mention dexmedetomidine, because dexmedetomidine, as you know, can attenuate the delirium memory deficits. And we used a reverse translational approach. Just ask, well, is it dex capable of preventing this overexpression? And it is. So at least it points again to this overexpression possibly being a contributing factor to these memory deficits, and possibly a mechanism to account for the effectiveness of DEX in preventing the delirium we see in the post-op period. It doesn't get rid of all of it, and it's a multifactorial problem, but DEX is probably the one drug, at least in the ICU, we can use now. And so there's a couple of videos produced by Anesthesiology where one particular paper was published that explains the DEX model. So the notion is that we understand the problem now, and we're using multiple pharmaceutical approaches to mitigate, and then we'll team up with our translational folks. And while we study within the context of anesthesia-related problems, it turns out overexpression of those receptors happens in traumatic brain injury, and that work is just underway in the lab. Infection and sepsis, inflammation, IL-1 beta drives it up, and even dementia seems to have an overexpression of this inhibitory effect. And to facilitate the translation, we've built this perioperative brain center at Sunnybrook Health Science Center, which is simply a team. It's a group of clinicians and scientists, psychiatrists, statisticians who are coming together to try and build the platform for undertaking some of the clinical trials. So we have a dexmedetomidine clinical trial for cardiac surgery looking at the long-term 6-month out cognitive deficits. And this may be the platform once we hopefully engage some pharmaceutical firms that are willing to come into the perioperative domain. It's often not easy to engage them because it is a high-risk domain and they don't want their drugs studied when there's the risk of complication. It's tricky. We need to attract pharmacy into the perioperative domain. There are opportunities to do better for our patients. But the center was a result of this, and Steve Choi, who's one of our emerging faculty, is the clinical director of this program. We've also been working, and this is the idea of teams, with the American Society of Anesthesiologists and their perioperative brain health program, trying to get the word out, building the websites, looking for funding, developing white papers and position papers. So that's sort of where we started and where the program is now, and I thought I'd offer some cheap advice. So I just want to say, whether you're an educator or a researcher or administrator, it's important you train early if research is your interest. Training is really important. And the habits you develop now in your career will propel you forward or hold you back. It's very important that you get your habits early. It's the same clinically, right? But watch your mentors. Work with the best mentors you can find, and then observe them carefully. Watch what they do. They got to where they are for a reason, and it kind of looks easy, but there's a lot of history behind that. So really watch how they work professionally, how they respond to people, their thinking. Just watch them like a hawk and surround yourself by good mentors and form those good habits. What research topic do you want to, pursue? I can't tell you that. I never had a master plan. My goodness, I started up in northern Newfoundland, right? So I didn't have a plan. But what we tried to do was ask, once we got into the research, what's the most compelling, coolest, exciting experiment we can design and do it? And then always watch ourselves. Are we doing the right experiment or the easy one? Are we being expedient or really trying to discover something new? And don't get stuck in a rut, right? You can't pivot too soon. You've got to get your chops, get your experience, but then once you launch, be ready to pivot if you need to, or even completely change the direction of your research, education, teaching. Remain light-footed. For the investigators, focus on your data. it's all about the data. And you can get pulled into seminars and teaching and all this kind of stuff, but it's the data that will enrich your program. And it will have a life of its own, but you need to sit quietly, study, concentrate, and the data will tell you the new stories. And if your data don't fit your hypothesis, good. It's because you're wrong. And if you look at the data carefully, it'll help you understand where you've made your errors. But your data is your best friend. Be very careful about your assumptions and biases. They can be an incredible waste of time, and they can take you down a rabbit hole or a dead end, and you can spend a lot of time on them. You don't know what you don't know. Let your friends tell you, but be very careful about your biases. Don't dither, just get on with it, do the experiment. That said, good science is driven by careful planning. It's this balance about making sure you're getting her done, but being extremely careful about detail. And good research is all about excellence and that last 10%, and good planning. So for senior people and those that are at the stages of building careers, work with diverse teams. We all work better when we work with a diverse group of people, whether it be however you define diversity, but that's going to get you your best result. It's very important that you set yourself up with a variety of people on your teams. And I'll leave you with a final quote, and that is, there is one thing even more vital to science than intelligent methods, and that is the sincere desire to find out the truth, whatever it might be. So as you launch into your careers, be relentless, be innovative, find your own truth, but most importantly, enjoy the journey. That's it.
All right. We take any questions?
Okay. I'm just going to weigh in again, Stu Foreman from MGH. And thank you both for wonderful talks. For George, wow. I guess, you addressed the why in terms of the benefits that accrue to the exceptional amount of administrative leadership, work that you have taken on, and all the networking opportunities that have emerged. Can you talk about the personal costs and of making that decision and how it's impacted your family? And I mean, you said thankfully it hasn't impacted your research, great, but it must have cost you something. I'd love to hear a little bit about that side of how you
I'm
made
happy
that
to
decision.
talk about this, and I talk freely about it with my psychoanalyst 4 times a week. But so I think, yeah. So I mean, it's a really good point, and I think it's an important point to think about the balance. What I'm doing right now is not sustainable. Okay, and I think at some point, I'm going to need to give something up. I was kind of in a weird zone when I started this because I was in my late 40s, and I was like, well, I felt like I was, if I was 10 years older, I could just focus on helping others and just mentorship and leadership. If I was 10 years younger, I could just think about myself, but I'm kind of right in the middle, and I'm not ready to give it all up. So I think the personal cost, I mean, I've been probably less healthy than I should be because, as my colleagues and collaborators like Max will tell you, I get up at 3 in the morning sometimes, and I'm doing 2 to 3 hours of work before I go to work for a 12-hour day because I'm still working. I've had 2 R01s competitively renewed since I've been in this role, so I'm still working hard as a scientist, and I haven't wanted to give that up. Now, on the plus side, again, I've got a great team, and I really worked hard to mentor them up and pull them up. And I would tell them freely, I said, part of it, I love to mentor, I love to see people succeed. Part of it's, I'm not being altruistic, I'm thinking about myself because I want this to keep going, and I still want to be doing new things. So I think balance is important. I have not achieved that as I should, but I think now I'm getting to, a new phase where I'm ready to let some of those other things go.
Thank you.
Can I-
Oh, sure, go, please,
So
Bev.
one thing that I've found really helpful is that I've always looked for mentors. So I see myself as having a personal board of directors, and sometimes even formally approach people. For example, I've been the chair for a year and a half, and I meet with the dean every month for a half an hour. Hugely helpful. Part of that board of directors are my kids, because boy, oh boy, they keep me honest. You know, and you do have to surround yourself by people that have your best interest in heart, but also keep you on the straight and narrow, and keep yourself, those checks and balances going. So I would say mentors, no matter where you are at your stage of career, are extremely important. And even when we get to be, you know, more senior or whatever that means, you just keep going. You need to listen to the people around you to make sure you're not stepping on landmines or making some pretty bad decisions.
And just one comment to Bev, your comment about when your hypothesis doesn't fit the result is absolutely key. When you simply confirm your hypothesis, that's nice, but you haven't learned anything. You know, when the data doesn't fit, that's when you have to get creative and actually start to learn. So follow, you know, people hate it when their experiment doesn't give them the results they expect, but they should love it.
Thank you both. This question is primarily for Dr. Mashour, but Dr. Orser, you may have some insights into it too throughout your long career. Can you comment pragmatically on maybe the non-R01 mechanisms of getting collaborative research funded, especially like surgical versus anesthesia colleagues working together, and who sets up the grants and how you organize that and how you approach colleagues about that sort of situation? You can use the tracheo Malaysia stents as an example,
Right.
maybe?
I mean, I think there are a lot of different options. Are you talking about now or sort of downstream as you evolve in your
Both
career?
for me. I mean, I'm a will be an assistant professor shortly, but so focus on that for me, I guess, but for the group as a
Sure.
whole.
I mean, I think, well, in the U.S., I mean, there are a couple of major federal sources, right? NIH, you can have an R01, there could be some other type of grant. PCORI is another option. And then the NSF, although that's not really something of direct relevance, although Michael Avedon, for example, has gotten some funding, as you know, through the NSF to help with machine learning algorithms to be applied. I mean, I think, you know, you're at WashU, you've got a lot of resources, you've got your CTSA Institute. I mean, typically there are an abundance of pilot grant programs to get things started. But I think it's important to kind of keep your eye on the prize in terms of what are the steps of your training grant. You know, the foundations, I'm part of FAIR and we're part of IARS. I mean, we want to be helping all of you, you know, to have some protected time, to have some support to get those early data. I think it is important, though, to be thinking about the track record, moving to the K and moving to the R or something equivalent. So I feel like I haven't quite addressed your question, but I'm not, like, what do you have in mind that you're...
So let's say how
clear?
does your surgical and anesthesia team decide on percent effort and who's going to be doing what funding, and how do you find, like, there are lots of surgical colleagues I have who are interested in research, but they don't have research training. You know, they're more senior than I am in some situations, and so it kind of ends up being awkward being the lead PI on a grant with associate professors.
Right. Okay.
Maybe you don't seem to
I
have
see.
that
Well,
problem.
Yeah, no, well, that's a little bit different. So you're not talking about funding sources. What you're talking about is almost how to organize, how to appropriately organize
teams,
a collaboration. And I mean, I don't have any great algorithm, but I would say, and I think anybody would say who's been in a collaboration, being thoughtful from the outset. I mean, before anything starts, to be very, very clear about expectations, to be very clear about roles and responsibilities, to be very clear about authorship positions is going to save you a ton of headache down the line. The other thing is, for you at a relatively early career, but really for any of you, don't work with people who don't know how to do research. I mean, that is not going to work out well for you, and especially now, you have got to be selective in terms of working with the right people who have more knowledge than you. I mean, that's that's not a good situation to be in if you've got an associate professor who doesn't really understand research methodology. So I would recommend that you stick with the great mentors that you have around you and make sure you're surrounded by people who know more than you and can help educate you as you're moving along.
Great.
I just want to support that. I think early on, you should find yourself in some sort of symbiotic parasitic role on a grant. And you need to watch how that grant rolls out. There is an art to grant writing, but it's formulaic. And you need to watch your mentors, be a junior on that grant so that by the time you get to the point where you want to write your first grant, you've been through a number of grant writing processes, because you need to see that process to know how it rolls out. But I absolutely agree, especially when you're starting, you need to surround yourself by people who already have a strong research track record and watch them carefully. You can't grow this de novo. You need to learn how to do it step by step.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for coming. It was a great panel. One question I had, and this I was actually going to ask Dr. Evers this last time, but it's applicable to what you guys were talking about too, is we're always told, especially as young investigators, we have to focus. We have to finish things. Unfortunately, things just don't always work. And if we put all our eggs in one basket and that basket breaks, we're kind of 2 or 3 years in. And so I think that's one of the things, I realize we can't be like doing everything, but it's very difficult to decide how much is too much to keep, how many irons to keep hot, if you will.
So when I have a new person come to the lab, for example, we have the SAFE project that gets the paper out, and then we have the COOL project, which is the high-risk one, which is really intriguing. And I think you should keep a steady, safe track record of productivity, but also, and it may not be your big ambition, but create a safe project for yourself, because you do need to show a continuous line of papers or abstracts or whatever. So don't put all your eggs in one basket, like you say. On the other hand, you will find those interesting things, like we were hearing, right? That it's the unpredictable piece that you want to chase and you don't want to ignore, right? So it's a balance, but do keep, your baseline program going. I don't know how you feel about
I would agree 100%. I mean, I always tell people it's like a financial portfolio. You have to diversify, and you have to have some safer bets. And I mean, it's tough. I mean, one project, you could spend your whole life working on one project. I mean, at some point you've got to draw the line in terms of what narrative you want to get out there. But I think it is important to stay productive. There's an old joke about promotion committees that they can count, but they can't read. In other words, they see how many papers you've done. They don't necessarily always discern where it is or what it's about. So you can also have a focus. It doesn't need to be laser-like, but, a certain coherent set of activities. I think that's really what's important. Like when I was starting out, I was working on intraoperative awareness and clinical research, and I was working on other things in the experimental setting, but it had a theme of consciousness, and I kind of branded myself, if you will. I mean, not really consciously, but I would, not really as part of a master plan, but I realized looking back, and I was like, oh yeah, I guess I was branding myself. You're hammering on a certain set of topics because then it helps you get recognized, et cetera. But I think, I totally agree. It's good to have a diverse portfolio, have kind of the aspirational goal. And also, I think if you're starting out, certainly in a lab, it's hard to, you want to start something from scratch. It might take you 2 years. I mean, you think about a tenure timeline, it's pretty short, And so I think to start off, it's nice to jump into something that's already active. And like when I have a grad student, it's like, all right, let's get you in on this. And while you're working on that, you can start setting up the big thing that you want to do in the long run.
All right, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Kristen Schreiber from Brigham and Women's. One thing, so within the Harvard system, the promotion process is, I guess, notoriously slow. And I hear often like, oh, you have to do this and that to get promoted to the next level. And we've been talking a lot about promotion, academic promotion. How important is that? Sometimes I feel like that doesn't seem that important as long as you're making some progress, or at least, say, for the first grant, at least you have some position in your institution. But what's your perspective on, like, as you go through your career, how important is it to get to that next, like, sort of name? And sort of related to that, there are usually several tracks. And I've also gotten the advice like, oh, maybe you don't want to go down the research track, even though you're research oriented, because it's easier to get advancement through a different kind of track, like a clinical innovation or whatever. Anyhow, so is that even important when it comes to, say, getting grants and that kind of stuff?
Well, so I'll just say there was a Nobel Prize in Physics awarded to a Canadian at Waterloo, and she was an associate professor because she never bothered, Dr. Strickland, she never bothered to seek promotion. That's one embarrassing comment. She was very rapidly promoted. I think they convened a separate promotion committee. That wasn't important to her. But on the other hand, it's the university's way of setting their bar and recognizing good work. And I think we do, as anesthesiologists, need to be recognized for our good work. And I would say, as a community, it is very important that we as a team recognize each other, because the work is going on anyway, and support each other so that we are having people at the associate professor level and the professor level, because it speaks to the profession and it moves us, it raises everybody's boat. So some people always say I'm not interested, but I think it is important as a community that we have the work acknowledged within the field and seek promotion.
I would agree. I mean, I think existentially, no, it's not transformative and you don't have to be thinking about it. But in terms of your professional activities, I think ultimately you want to set yourself up to have the greatest number of options downstream. And I think the currency of an academic setting does relate to rank. So, you're doing the work anyway. And the other thing is too, and I certainly haven't been driven by promotion, but when you're thinking about promotion and your career in general, you want to have a coherent narrative, and kind of thinking about what that portfolio or package looks like does help encourage you at least to think about that coherent narrative. I always tell people, think about your career like a novel. A good novel doesn't have a bunch of random facts or events that are in there. There's a protagonist, there's a plot that's driven by attention, and for us that tension might be to cure a disease or to solve a scientific problem. And there might be a lot of things, but it all fits into that plot and that tension. And that's what a good promotion package looks like. So I think it's important just in terms of professional options down the line. The other thing is, too, it helps you know when you can shift gear. I mean, it's just kind of like a demarcation point. So, I didn't think, when I was happy when I became an associate professor in tenure. I thought, all right, cool, I don't need to worry about this as much anymore and just keep doing what I'm doing. But, when I did become a professor, it was nice because then I said, I don't need to be senior author on it. This isn't going to help me anymore. And it kind of liberated me to say, yeah, I want to help this colleague because they're an associate professor. This can help them. And so it did kind of provide that demarcation point that allowed me to shift behaviors at those different points.
And I really like what you said there, because I think it's like grant writing. We have this love-hate thing with grant writing. Oh my God, I have to write this grant. But on the other hand, it forces you to sit down and collect your ideas and get organized and try and really explain to someone why you think what you're going to do is important. Promotion's a bit of the same. It's almost a personal check. Like you said, it's a pause to say, okay, what is my narrative? And where am I going next? And I think I can see, sir, you're nodding your head.
I just want to say, Jim Rathmel wants you to get promoted, even if you don't. You don't really have that much choice in that.
No, it's not that I don't want to. I just don't. I want less angst. That's what I want from you. Thank you so much.
But I was going to say, everybody does it at their own speed, and it depends on lots of variables: family, science, where you're at. But as long as you're moving forward, we're all in this for the marathon. You got to take your water breaks. You got to take your whatever. But promotion is a fantastic time to examine your own narrative. Can I really put down on 2 pages or 1 page what I'm about, what I'm trying to achieve? And it's hard work. It's hard work to really distill what you've done, and much more importantly, what's been the impact? You really have to ask yourself, where is my impact? And have I really, really done what I thought I had set out to do? So it's a good personal journey as well.
Actually had a question. Both of you have been very successful in advancing therapeutics down the translational pathway, and that generally requires buy-in from pharma and industry. And as you mentioned, especially in the perioperative setting, that can be fraught with difficulties. How did you go about building those relationships and even getting involved? And I think we're very isolated in academia, and just it's difficult to break into that.
I think these meetings are very important, and the specialty meetings, the small meetings, and get out there and network. The most important thing you'll do at the IARS is network, right? Because you can get the stuff on the app and all the rest, but it's to get out there and meet people. And so there may be people from pharma or reaching out. It's all about relationships. And it's a different culture in industry. So you need to be patient with their culture, because sometimes it just drives me crazy. Because they're a for-profit company. They're protectionists. They're risk adverse. And so they may not see the compelling need to move something into clinic. So you do need to speak a different language and have a different approach and develop a different relationship with industry, all the while being very aware of the ethics of your relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I know when I was starting out, because I have more of a basic science orientation, and somebody from industry wanted to talk to me, but moi? Industry? No, this is dirty business. I don't want anything to do. I'm an academic, I'm a purist. We have to engage for a number of reasons. First of all, if you make a discovery and you want to have an actual impact, it likely will have to go through a process of commercialization and get out onto the market. And so you're going to need to understand what goes on in industry, and you're going to need to have connections. And you might have to start off doing an industry study so that later you can actually have some influence on the types of studies that are being done. Second of all, it's good to have a balanced funding portfolio as well. I've had some industry grants, it's not been the bulk of my funding, but it has been a good source. And so I think that it's definitely important to cultivate those relationships. Finally, when it comes to the clinical research space, some of the work that is done in industry in terms of the protocol development blows away some of the half-ass stuff that I see in the academic setting. I mean, people do not plan well for clinical trials very often, or clinical research. There is a very rigorous way of approaching it in industry, and in some cases the standards are much higher. And then finally, again, thinking about impact, when you're a scientist, you get jazzed up if the p-value is less than 0.5 or whatever. That's not going to cut it. That's not enough. You have to think really in terms of comparative effectiveness of, let's say, brain monitoring. There are all these things out there. How is this really better? How is this really going to make an advance? So thinking through that lens of industry, I think actually in some cases can really even help your science.
And your universities often have they'll have often a patent office, innovations office that can help you through this process. For example, my IP is owned by the University of Toronto, and I'm very happy to let them have at it, let their lawyers write the IP, because it's very complicated. You want to be protectionist, but you can't be too protectionist, or someone's going to blow you out of the water, 2 years down the line. You need that expertise. You need to, gradually build relationships in the IP office if you think that's where you're going, and share your disclosures early and get advice. Yeah, and use that team to interface with the industry as well to keep you on the straight and narrow. Make sure you're not making any mistakes as you move your program forward. You don't need to do this stuff on your own.
Great.
Aaron Norris from Washington University. So I have like sort of a two-sided question, really. One question, just two aspects. I think these sessions are very valuable. but it was pointed out to me recently the limited use of advice as advice, and that there's a really important piece of coaching or mentoring. And the question that I wanted to ask is, as someone who does mentoring and has been mentored, how would you suggest people reach out to find good mentors? Like, what's that process you would suggest? And perhaps share an example of in your case, someone who's approached you and done it very poorly, and someone who's done it very well. And then on the flip side, how do you approach taking on mentees, and examples of maybe when that's done, you've been like, that was a really good choice of taking that mentee on, and sometimes when you decided maybe that was a really bad choice, or just in general. So that's that question. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and mentorship is important at all stages. I know something that I look for, just from the perspective of being a mentor, is passion and specific passion for what I'm doing. I mean, I get all sorts of generic emails or quasi-generic emails about wanting to work for me, and I'm sorry, I'm just not that interested. But when I sense that somebody is truly passionate about studying consciousness, I understand that it is such a narrow field, and part of what I'd like to do at the University of Michigan, I founded a Center for Consciousness Science, is really to create a home for those people. So for me, like hearing about specific thoughts on the topic that we're studying, seeing that someone's done their homework, that means a lot. And as you're moving on, you're going to be getting lots of people who want to reach out, medical students and residents, et cetera. So make sure that they've done their homework. If they haven't done their homework beforehand, they're probably not going to be doing their homework very well after you've agreed to take them on. I think that you have to be critical in the early phases too, and really be observing behaviors and be ready to cut it off, because I'll tell you, Dr. Orser's the chair, she knows it, I know it too. If you get into a situation where you have to deal with like HR issues or firing or breaking off that relationship down the line, it can sometimes drain the life out of you. I mean, it takes a lot of time. So you really have to be critical at the outset, I think, and be ready to move on quickly if somebody doesn't seem to be working out. I've had some difficult situations before. I had a postdoc that worked with, a project with Max Keltz, and he was a kind of a weird guy, but I thought he was like eccentric and cool. I saw some potential, but then as I've said before, he went from being an interesting person to a person of interest, and ultimately got into legal stuff and all this weirdness, and I'm like, what the hell, So you have to try. You got to certainly watch out for biases, but you also have to trust your gut instinct. We had another situation like that. I met the guy. I was like, whoa, he is really weird and wrapped up tight, but I thought maybe he just likes to have his head down in the lab. Well, he was threatening violence like 6 months later, and he had to be physically removed. So you see these things, but again, you've really got to reflect early on. It's like, did that feel right? Did that feel like a really positive interaction? And act on those impulses, and don't get into magical thinking about how well it's going to work out. And when you really start to do that is sometimes when you're kind of desperate. It's like, I need somebody to fill this position for this protocol or this technical aspect, and that's when you start making bad decisions, or at least I have.
So as a mentee, and I go around trying to find my next board of directors, as we change through career, a couple of things is, one, it's my responsibility to be prepared when I go see this person and give them an idea of what I'm hoping to achieve through this relationship. It's not just like, I'm here. You can do that with your kids, but not with your professional relationships, right? And so I explain to them what I'm trying to move forward on, some of the challenges I'm facing where I think that they can help me understand a few things. And so, for example, when I go to see the dean, often I'll have a couple questions, challenges that I want to bounce off of him. Invariably, the conversation goes somewhere else. But still, I come looking for a bit of advice. I'm very respectful of their time. I don't take a lot of their time, and I know a half an hour is generous. These are always busy people. And so I'm very careful about staging it a couple times a year and coming prepared and being thoughtful and defining that relationship early on. As a mentor, Probably the folks I spend the most time with are grad students, because I have a career obligation to them to launch them on their way, and it's a lifetime relationship with someone who comes into my lab invariably. In fact, one of the people that came from Hugh Hemming's lab as a new Canadian, and as she initially worked as a technician, and then she was a grad student, and then lo and behold, she got citizenship, she went to medical school, and she's here as a first-year resident in the IARS program. Wow, that's so exciting to me. But that is a lifelong relationship with my trainees. But there again, there's a mutual respect about, you know, how much time I can send. If they want a letter of reference, I expect them to give me enough notice. Often they'll craft the draft of that. And so, but they know that. That's the way that relationship moves forward. So it very much is a bidirectional relationship that has constraints and objectives.
Right. Well, I think that is all the time we have.
Thank you both very much.
For joining us.